All right, I'm here at PorcFest with the author of Machinery of Freedom, David Friedman. Welcome. Pleasure
Thank
to
you.
meet you again. How are
Always
you?
enjoy being at PorcFest with lots of small kids and dogs and friendly people. I noticed there's a dodgeball game.
We got the dodgeball going on right
background.
behind us. Maybe we'll jump into the fray after this. How many years have you been coming here to PorcFest?
This is at least my third, and I know I was here in 2013 because I discovered that I used the same talk title then that I'm about to use here, which I hadn't realized, but I was looking through my old outlines of old talks, and there was one for PorcFest 2013.
What is the talk you'll be giving later on today?
On legal systems very different from ours. That's my most recent book, and it includes Imperial China and Periclean Athens, but also modern Amish and Romany. I'm actually going to be arguing at the beginning that the Amish are really anarchists. They're just very rule-oriented anarchists and quite interesting people, and there are a lot of them, and they're pretty successful. But also, the book includes things like Islamic law and Jewish law and Saga period Icelandic law and Somali law and a bunch of other systems. And
Do you have a favorite legal system that you studied or learned about through the course of this book?
not really. The first one I got interested in long before the book was Saga period Iceland, which was a society where, in effect, if you killed somebody, his relatives sued you. And if the suit went all the way and you were convicted, it was up to them to kill you. That is, you were outlawed, it was legal to kill you, but there was no state mechanism to do it. So that was an interesting system in which what I usually describe as a semi-stateless society, in that there was a law code, there was a court system, though most cases settled outside of court, but there was no executive arm of government to enforce anything.
Is that the overall idea behind this book that
No.
you've done? No, is it?
The overall idea behind the book is that all human societies face about the same problems. They solve them in an interesting variety of different ways, and they're all grown-ups. And therefore you should take each of them seriously as one way in which some people at some place in time dealt with legal problems and try to understand it, see what problems it raised, how they dealt with them, and so forth.
You know, when I read your book, Machinery of Freedom, a few years ago, one thing that struck me is that when you'd originally written that, you almost predicted a lot of things that have come about. I mean, you talked about cab systems where people might just, you basically described Lyft and Uber as it is today, 30 years ago. Do you have any sort of, predictions about how, a lot of people here are doing talks about cryptocurrency and that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts about ways that we'll see, our monetary systems or our legal systems drastically change in the next, 20 or 30 years from now?
I have a book published some time ago called Future Imperfect, and I'm not really given predictions there because I think the future, especially technology, is really very hard to predict. What I'm doing there is sketching out possibilities. So if the technology develops in a certain way, then you could have the following kinds of results. So that one of the particularly interesting ones I explore there is the tension between encryption and surveillance. That you've got one set of technologies which are tending to make online activity potentially more private than anything humans have ever lived in, and another set of technologies, namely surveillance, which tends to make real space less private than we've ever lived in. And then if you get both of them, what happens? And I spend some time on that. So that's one of them. To take something much less drastic, but that I'm involved in directly, self-publishing, where it looks as though to a considerable extent the job that used to be done by publishers is disappearing, not entirely disappearing, but at this point it's essentially costless to self-publish a book, either as a print book or as a Kindle. There are some difficulties. You're going to have to find an editor and hire, but there are freelance editors. That's what my daughter does.
I mean, similar to podcasting, you used to have to, if you wanted to get your voice out there, you used to have to go to one of, 4 mega corporations and beg them to put you on the radio. Now, it's similar to self-publishing. It's very easy to start a podcast. Even, again, if you don't have the skills, very easy to hire a freelance editor, freelance producers. It's the kind of trend that we're seeing where people are able to take charge and bring things into their own hands as opposed to begging companies to let them do it.
And similarly, you have to find a cover. But the cover for the book that I'll probably be doing next is designed by somebody who was here yesterday, who did the cover for the third edition of Machinery. The cover for my Legal Systems Very Different book was done by somebody who liked my writing, who I mentioned that I needed a cover on Facebook, and she volunteered to do one. It's a really nice cover. So there are a lot of sort of decentralized ways, some of them decentralized commercial in the sense you hire someone to do them, and some of them decentralized, what I sort of think of as a gift economy, in which people voluntarily transact to do things because they want to do them. And both of those are developing, and those are certainly interesting things. What else will happen is very hard to know. That one of the very big changes that might happen, though probably not in my lifetime, is if we solve aging. That everybody now alive is dying of an incurable disease that we call old age. Right. There doesn't seem to be any inherent reason why that can't be solved. It hasn't been, and various people are trying. And if we had a world where people didn't grow old, it would be a very different society in a lot of ways, good and bad. So that's one of the ones that might happen, but I don't know what will happen.
So are you a fan of the transhuman movement then, from your libertarian perspective, just from the idea of eventually we can sort of replace so much of ourselves, whether it's our genes or just our arms or our eyes, that eventually we don't need to die. We can just replace everything as we go.
I think that's not the most likely way it'll happen. Again, I don't know the future, so I would have said that it is much more likely that we will find ways of preventing aging or even reversing aging with the bodies we now have. Now, we already have all sorts of extra things that, I've got
even just glasses.
I have a silicon memory in my pocket, and it keeps track of things that I don't remember for myself, and beeps me when I'm supposed to be somewhere, and obviously clothes and glasses and hearing aids and all of those things. But I think that the big change on aging is not going to be patching particular breakdowns. It's going to be figuring out more clearly than we have so far why it is that our bodies age, and find ways of stopping and perhaps reversing that process. But I don't know that it'll happen. I'm just saying that there are a lot of changes that could happen, and I don't think we can tell which ones will. But if people are curious, my book Future Imperfect you can read for free from my webpage, which is daviddfriedman.com. I generally make my books either available free online or inexpensive from Amazon as Kindle or print books, because I'm writing books mainly to get people to read them, not mainly as a source of income. So if people are curious about my views on the future, you can get them in much more detail by going to my webpage and reading Future Imperfect than by an interview.
We'll send them there. David, I'm curious what you feel about the strategy that the Free State Project takes, basically moving a lot of like-minded people to a similar area with the hopes that they will change things in a way that can sort of bring about a more libertarian society, at least on the local level, and maybe more so even setting an example for how others can do it, whether it's through seasetting or the project in Honduras, that sort of thing. What do you think about that as a strategy of getting just like-minded people to move to a similar area, a similar geographic area, in order to create change in that way?
It is clearly one strategy. That is, I don't think there is a correct libertarian strategy. I believe in division of labor, and I think that is one thing that works for some people and that could make the world better. Seasteading is something that might work and could make the world better. Free cities is something that probably is working to some extent and could make the world better. I like to claim that the best form of government we've ever discovered is competitive dictatorship. That's the way we run restaurants, that's the way we run hotels. I have no vote on what's on the menu, but an absolute vote on which restaurant I go to. And to some extent, the Free City movement gives you some of that, and the other thing that gives you some of that is the development of more and more activity online. Because if you're working online, you can live anywhere and have the same job. If many of your friends are online, you can stay in touch with them and move. And so the more mobile people are, the less power governments have. And sort of you could imagine the limiting case, if moving costs get close to zero, is that governments are really just landlords. And they've got to compete to provide an environment that people want. So that's sort of an interesting possibility. But what will happen, I don't know. That generally things are getting both better and worse at the same time in different ways. That when I was in college, socialism was something that intelligent people could believe in. And if you really look, almost everybody now who says he's a socialist isn't. Almost all of them are really talking about Scandinavian welfare states, which are other than the welfare, are a little bit more capitalist than the U.S. as far as I can tell. So the old idea that if you wanted to to develop India, you needed 5-year plans,
right.
And similarly elsewhere, has pretty much died, and that's a big improvement. At the same time, environmentalism has, in a sense, substituted for socialism.
Right.
It produces a new set of arguments for governments interfering with what people are doing. In one sense, that's an improvement, because on the whole, they're better arguments. On the other hand, they frequently, perhaps usually, are used to argue for things that are not a good idea, because you're still facing the problem that individual voters have no incentive to be well informed. Therefore, whatever sounds like a good idea, if you haven't thought about it very much, tends to be what gets popular. And governments have an incentive to find excuses for doing things, for taxing people and controlling them and such. So I think environmentalism may well on net make us worse off, even though I would say that intellectually it's a more defensible argument than socialism was.
Why do you say it's more defensible? Just because, theoretically there is an environment that could be destroyed by humans, and therefore...
Because it is the case that your actions affect other people in ways that it is very hard to take account of through market institutions. So that essentially the fundamental problem is that there is no workable way of running a large society from the center. All human societies face a problem, which economists call the coordination problem. Given that you've got millions of people, and in order to do almost anything, a large number of them have to somehow coordinate their activities. That, to make a car, someone's got to be making steel, and the right kind of steel, and the right amount of steel, and glass, and rubber, and all the rest. And there are two solutions to that problem, and the obvious one doesn't work. And the obvious one is you have someone at the top who says, you do this, you do that, you do that. And that works for very small organizations, but it doesn't work on a national scale, which is part of the reason the Soviet Union ended up poor. The other way is some decentralized mechanism where each person is solving a tiny bit of the problem. And to get that to work right, you need some way where when I make a decision, my interest is our interest. Some way where I am taking account of both costs and benefits to everybody. They are being converted into costs and benefits to me. So if there's a net benefit, I take the action, a net cost, I don't. And markets are a way of doing that. And in the ordinary, simple case, they do it almost perfectly. But if one of the things I'm doing is putting smoke out, which affects 100,000 people downwind, each of them by a tiny amount, it is very hard to use markets to control that. So there are a set of problems, what we refer to as market failure problems, where individual rationality doesn't produce group rationality. And the problem is that there isn't a solution, because the political mechanisms that people want to use to solve those are also subject to market failure, that the individual voter does not bear the net costs of his vote. The individual legislator or lobbyist or judge is making decisions where almost all the costs and benefits go to someone else. So we don't really have a decent way of making the political system make the right decisions.
So we're just going to have to breathe the smoke on this one, I guess.
That's one possibility, or else we will have a government that prevents the smoke, but also turns a third of the corn crop of the U.S. into alcohol, on the excuse that it's preventing global warming, which as best I can tell it isn't, but for the actual reason that they want to get votes from farmers, and turning corn into alcohol bids up the price of corn, and that means farmers like you. So I think you either end up with the government trying to solve the problem, but a government that can solve that problem creates a bunch of other problems, or you end up with the problem unsolved.
So. David, finally, what is your favorite part of being here at PorcFest? Whenever I'm walking around, I always see you chatting with people. Is that kind of the one thing you like doing? Just talking about these ideas is obviously something you're passionate about.
Part of it is certainly talking with people. Part of it is an environment with lots of cute little kids around and sort of generally friendly people. It's a pleasant, relaxed kind of place. When I showed up Thursday, it was raining, and there were a bunch of people over there, largely in shorts and such, doing dodgeball in the rain. And I thought that was sort of typical of what PorcFest is like. And they're doing it now in the sun.
There we go. Maybe you go play some dodgeball when we're done here.
Probably not. I'm not sure I'm flexible enough at my present age, though it's tempting. And I'm not very good at throwing things, so I'm afraid I would be a failure at
Except
dodgeball.
truth bombs.
Yeah, no, I'm more tempted by the boffers because I'm much better with a sword than with a ball, but I'm not sure I'm going to try that either.
Well, David, it's been a blast talking to you. I'll look forward to your talk later. We'll see you around.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.